Okay, thank you. I'd like to welcome you all to the Radio Amateurs of Canada online conference. This is the second one that we've run. And to this session, which is a fireside chat. We did this at our first conference last year. It proved to be very useful and entertaining at times as well. So I'm really pleased to have with me today Rick Roderick, K5UR, who is the president of the ARRL, Tim Ellam, VE6SH, who's the president of the International Amateur Radio Union, and Steve Thomas, M1ACB, who is the general manager of the Radio Society of Great Britain. So we have here people who are involved in leading the major English-speaking amateur radio organizations in the world, I would think. RAC being, of course, the smallest in comparison to the others, but we're really happy to have you here. What we will be talking about today, and this will be a fairly free and open discussion, will be amateur radio today, and in 2021, that's difficult to talk about without thinking of the effects of the pandemic on us. We have had a year and a half, I suppose, of this. We've learned things, we've adapted in some ways. In some parts of the world, we're seeing shapes of what the future might be, but it's still that light in a tunnel which seems to recede as time passes. I know here in Canada, just in the last couple of days, one of our largest banks announced that it thought that the earliest it would bring its workforce back into the office would be in 2022. So we'll be dealing with this for a bit, but I'm just going to go around through, maybe I'll ask Steve Thomas to talk about some of the things. Were a year ago, Steve pointed out that amateur radio got a lot more focus in the early days of the pandemic, and it led to actually a lot more people becoming active. I'm wondering how that's going now, Steve.
Well, thanks for inviting me first, Glenn. It's great to be back. It's been tremendously busy, like hugely busy across all of amateur radio. We've seen thousands of people joining, and we've seen a great number of people coming back to amateur radio as well, which is fantastic. I love sort of both things. I love to see new people come in, and I love to see people coming back to it as well, because I kind of think that we've reminded them about amateur radio, or they see something different about it. They want to come back to it. So we've seen all of that, and we've just started now to sort of just tiptoe back into the real world a little bit. I've been doing some of that over the last couple of days, but we've seen that great growth, and I think I told you the other day our RSGB membership is at the height it was 10 years ago. It's come back to those numbers, but we've seen thousands of people joining through the online exams, and many people coming back to it as well.
Okay, thanks. I guess the pandemic has lots of different effects that effects on supply chains. I know Rick mentioned when we were talking about some of this earlier. So some things that we might not think of are secondary or even tertiary, but end up affecting what it is that we're able to do. I wonder if you wanted to pick on some of that, Rick, and maybe let us know a bit about as well how things are going in the United States. It's a very large country with lots of different circumstances in different parts of it.
That's true, Glenn. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. And I want to send greetings to everyone from the ARRL Board of Directors and our headquarters staff and our members as well. It's a pleasure to be here again. We appreciate the invitation, Glenn, to attend the Fireside Chat here, so to speak, and the conference, and hopefully later the general meeting. So thank you very much. I'd also like to say I really appreciate Glenn MacDonell for his leadership to help us over the years that he's given to me and to the league. As you may know or recall, Glenn attends our ARRL board meetings, and he's a very valued individual for our board, and we often consult him and get his ideas and input. And he's helped me out an awful lot. So I think y'all need to know he's served y'all well for the time that he's been with us in our board meetings and in between times. Thank you, Glenn. But it has been a challenging year and a half. Our ARRL headquarters, which has about 90 employees, had been shut down because of particularly tight restrictions up in Connecticut. And like Glenn said, it varies around the United States quite a bit as to local conditions and things. But to shut an organization down that's a member organization, member-driven organization, and close the phones and the door is quite remarkable. And we've got about 158,000 members out of the 780,000 hams in America. And of course, a lot of their non-members still rely on us. So we've got those phones ringing all the time. And so people had to start working at home. And I'm real proud of the fact that I don't know that we missed hardly anything. Really, everybody adapted very well. I don't think I had necessarily any complaints saying we didn't respond or get back with people. So everyone seemed to understand. I was quite amazed by that. But everybody did a real good job, but it did impact our operations. And of course, it impacts businesses, and businesses had to shut down. And that's very troubling with the amateur radio businesses, because as y'all know, for the last several years, that market has been consolidating, and there's not nearly as many retail and wholesale outlets out there that there used to be. And so they took an awful hit as well on the business side of things. But, Glenn mentioned the supply chain issue that we talked about in one of our previous sessions, but it's just awful here in America, and probably the same way in Canada. I mean, I've got a buddy that sent his amplifier off over a year ago, and they can't get parts for the dadgum thing to get repaired. Had another friend just the other day send one of his transceivers off to get repaired. It's going on about 4 months now because they can't get just a few parts. So it's pretty bad. I mean, from the feedback we get in some situations. So it sure has changed people's way of thinking, I guess, about whether or not they ought to try to get inside that radio and repair it themselves the way we tried to do many years ago. But it has really challenged us to work remotely, and that also goes to the local clubs at Hamfest. I think like last year alone, I think there was 250 Hamfest and events canceled in the United States. Maybe more than that. That was about going into the fourth quarter, if I remember correctly. And we're still seeing that to this day. I mean, it's a few of the Hamfest I've attended lately. One of them was canceled. The others have required masks. A lot of people won't even go if you have to wear a mask. And before I forget it, Glenn, talking about the variations down here in the South, for example, I've had clients that run businesses, some manufacturing concerns. They didn't miss a lick. They've been open 24 hours a day, 3-shift operations. They've not missed a lick. You go a few states over and they shut the whole plant down, and so it just varies where you are in the United States. You got down here in my area, you wouldn't dare wear a mask in a Walmart. Everybody look at you like you're some freak of nature, but you go up north, and if you don't have a mask on, you get escorted out of the store. So it's just a big variation in beliefs and values, I think. But that kind of goes to the clubs as well. I mean, some clubs continue to meet. Other clubs says we're not meeting until this is over, and they haven't had an in-person meeting in a year. So what do they do? And so we have seen a lot of clubs, meet virtually. And I got to thinking, well, maybe that's the way to get some of the members back active in a club. And I've had a few stories where people have said, well, our clubs have actually grown in numbers because, they're not having to physically go down to the local clubhouse or whatever. And they get on virtually, and they find that they can do presentations and have visitor presentations come in on Zoom, for example, that they wouldn't in person. So we've actually seen a little bit of an uptick in a few instances with clubs, but that may continue for a while, having those virtual meetings. Same thing with some of the Hamfest. They've decided to go virtual, as y'all may know, and that's expanded the opportunity for other people to participate that otherwise wouldn't even make it to the event. At headquarters now, though, we started coming back on earlier in the summer, with a few people back, half back. And then in July, we went full 100% back working in the office. And so we're firing on all cylinders again with everybody in the office, with still internal restrictions with watching, gatherings and wearing a mask and things like that. But it has pushed us to evaluate how we're going to do work in the future. And so one of our committees, our Administrative and Finance Committee, has been charged with the responsibility to evaluate remote work capabilities at ARRL headquarters for our jobs, which is a big step. A lot of people say, no, we gotta be in person. We got to see each other right here. I want you close to me, in these conference rooms and the cubicle next door. But in today's world, we found, maybe we don't need to have this person here. Maybe that person can work remotely, and maybe the best person for a vacancy that we have, and we've been filling vacancies in some key positions, as y'all may know too. We've got a new CEO, got a new director of operations, got a new manager of field services, and we've got a lot of job openings. If you look at our webpage, and the question has come up, do we really need those people to move to Connecticut? Because Connecticut is a very expensive state, and we've had a lot of real good candidates say, I ain't moving to the Northeast, so that kind of begs the question too about, do you really need to be physically present in Newington, Connecticut? So COVID has sort of pushed that issue to the front, and we're going to be studying that at ARRL over the next couple of 3 months. And that may mean sort of a big paradigm shift in the way we think about how we do our business. So that's a little background there, Glenn, on where we stand and what the future looks like. Glenn, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. And maybe I'll say a few things about Canada before I go to Tim, because I think Tim is going to talk to us particularly about some of the aspects on amateur radio and decision-making internationally. But some of the differences, and I'm not going to go into as much detail now as I will in my report. The very last item today is the Radio Amateurs of Canada's annual general meeting, where I'll highlight some of both the activities and challenges over the last year and a half. By the way, I'd also point out to people, I notice there's fairly active conversation on the chat, the parallel to this, as people are typing text in. Radio Amateurs Canada, being small with really 2 people who are paid to work for us, has always had to operate remotely across the country. So we've been able to keep that operating. We had to do it before because this is a very large country. I was tempted at the beginning to say good noon to people in Ontario, where I'm living, and good morning to everyone who is west of us, and good afternoon who's everyone to east of us, as we cover those 3.5 time zones. Like in the US, we've had people beginning to have Hamfest. I see there was one that took place recently in Moncton, in the Moncton area. We've had more examples, I think, than we've had in the past of people doing outdoor activities when they can. That's going to stop about now, I think, but Hamfest type things outdoors. So there are some of those adaptations. And we've found with club meetings, many of the clubs have actually found not only more people coming out to meetings when they can do it remotely. I'm going to talk about the age distribution of our radio amateurs after 4. There are a lot of people who are in the group that is most seriously challenged by the outcomes if they become sick. So there are more people coming to meetings, and clubs have been able to get speakers from anywhere in the world, which you couldn't do before. So those are, I think, some of the things that we will live with. The challenge is being, it's probably a lot easier doing, I've heard a number of clubs saying they'd like to do hybrid meetings when they can get back together. The challenges for the clubs, I think, is that it's one thing to have a meeting like this, which is completely online. Trying to do a mixed meeting that's partly online and partly in person is a challenge. And then the last point before going to Tim that I'll make is one of the biggest difficulties, and I think we've all experienced this, whether it's in our work or through meetings or events like this, is that there's a lot of useful exchanges of information that aren't parts of formal meetings. You know, companies are reporting that when someone's working on a difficult problem, sometime going to coffee with someone in an entirely different area will bring up things that they'd never occurred of in their group. And I know a few clubs that are starting a half an hour earlier so people can just exchange information and meet and do it a little bit after as well. But that's definitely, and I'm sure, I don't want to steal your thunder, Tim, but I know when you're talking about the work internationally, that's one of the things that comes up. So go ahead, Tim.
Okay, well, thanks, Glenn. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here again. Thanks for the invite. Glenn, you mentioned something at the outset that RAC was a small member of IARU, which you know, I just like to reiterate that RAC really punches above its weight in IARU matters. There's a number of volunteers from RAC that assist us, and all of our member societies, no matter what size they are, really help and support our work. So 2021, we had lots of hope that we would be back in in-person meetings, both at the ITU and at the regional telecom organizations such as CTEL. That obviously hasn't happened, and we are again mainly virtual. I don't think there's any in-person meetings scheduled for the rest of this year. So all of our volunteers have been attending ITU meetings, RTO meetings on a virtual level. A couple of challenges with that. One you hinted at, and that is a lot of what we do. We submit papers, we speak at these meetings, but a lot of what we do is obviously lobbying during the breaks at the meeting and having one-on-one discussions with individual administrations to ensure that our position on certain agenda items at the ITU are well known. We also have one-on-one meetings with ITU management to ensure that they understand where we're coming from on things. We have missed that, and that is a huge challenge for us. The second thing is, I think everyone is getting tired of virtual meetings, notwithstanding this fine meeting you've organized today, Glenn. But I think a lot of people are getting tired. Time zones are an issue. A lot of the meetings, if they're in Europe, for example, that requires people to get up early to attend and to contribute, and that's posing a challenge for a number of our volunteers. The IARU itself hasn't met in person for over 2 years. We were hopeful that we could do an in-person meeting in October. That unfortunately could not happen. Some of our members could not travel, and the challenges in trying to do things in a hybrid fashion, I think, are just too difficult. Our conference this year is in Bangkok in Thailand, and in fact, wearing the shirt which the organizers sent me. But that starts very, very late in the evening for those in North America. I think Rick and I were talking before we jumped on this call. It's a 10 or 11 o'clock start, and then the finish is about 4 o'clock in the morning. So it's a challenge for everyone to contribute and to have discussions when there's such significant time changes. So I think going forward, people are looking to next year. And I know we said this last year at this time, that everyone's looking forward to next year, but I'm hopeful that some of our work at least will come back into in-person meetings in 2022.
So Tim, one thing I wonder, there's going to be a presentation in the first round on regulatory matters, and a couple of the people who you've mentioned from Radio Amateurs of Canada who are working closely with the IARU will be giving it the international part, and our regulatory affairs officer, the domestic part. But with what's happening in the rest of the world, with such low vaccination rates in parts of the world, what are the prospects of a real in-person meetings at the leading up to the next World Radio Conference?
I think that's going to continue to be a challenge. The ITU is hopeful that they can do some kind of hybrid meetings next year with the bulk of the people being in person, but it's a challenge to go to Geneva. Switzerland has a very high COVID rate at the moment. So how do you deal with that, for example? So I think people are being optimistic, but we'll have to see how things shake out over the course of 2022. It would be an issue, I think, if we cannot get back to some kind of in-person meetings next year. WRC 23 is not that far away. There's still a lot of work to do. It looks like the venue will be in Dubai, and that faces its own challenges of trying to get a number of delegates there in person. So I'm optimistic that we'll start to have some in-person meetings, but it may not have all the delegates present, and the ITU may have to operate in a hybrid fashion if they can.
Yeah, okay. The other thing that occurs to me, we are, because they are online, Radio Amateurs of Canada's representatives are active in some international meetings that, frankly, we couldn't have afforded to send them to in the past, and like other regional meetings that we're now involved in. But I remember you saying, I guess it was last year, Tim, and I think would be the same, that a lot of the influence that you have and other IARU people have, and in fact, even a lot of the resolution of major difficulties comes from informal discussions outside of formal meetings. And I guess those are really hard to do right now.
Yeah, typically that's how it works. And the meetings, there's a lot of technical discussions. There may be a lot of interested parties who are discussing the agenda items which are of interest to us. But where we really have an impact, I think, and I think the RAC representatives will back me up, is having one-on-one discussions. If there's a delegate from an administration who doesn't understand why this portion of the spectrum is important for the amateur service, that can be more easily resolved sort of offline and not in a formal meeting session. So I've been going to ITU meetings for over 20 years, and I can tell you the bulk of the work happens at coffee or over lunch or in the evenings.
Okay, thanks. I'll go to you, Steve, because one of the other things that in our pre-meeting chat that I found interesting was your experience in trying to get some things more opened up, and I guess some of the concerns of volunteers.
Yeah, I was going to come back to that. I wanted to pick up on something that Rick said about closing the office. And I just wanted to say, we were in exactly the same boat. We closed the office completely, and we've been sort of 18 months working from home. But I'm desperate to get everybody back in the office. In fact, I'm in the office this evening just because I wanted to come back in here. It's easy to set it up, but it's really weird coming into the empty office. But we've had a few people coming in and out, but most of it's been done from home. But it is so different to seeing people face to face. So I want to agree with Tim that we're kind of worn out of the online meeting world, but there's some places where it helps us tremendously. It's a balance, but I think we also talked about the hybrid event. It depends on the flow of information, doesn't it? Because we're currently planning our convention, which is on the 9th of October. We normally do it face to face, and people love that, but we get 500 people face to face. We did it last year online. We got 3,500 people live and 32,000 after the event. So but the information is flowing in one direction, isn't it? And if the information needs to flow in two directions, it's a very much different world. But I think that people are really desperate to get back to some of the real world activities, which that plays into. Yesterday, I was at our National Radio Centre, which is what I think you were alluding to just now. But our National Radio Centre at Bletchley Park, if we go back to 2019, we had 97,000 people there through the year. And that's where we demonstrate radio and amateur radio and, tell them a little bit about it. That's fantastic. Last year, we just had to close it. And that was a huge difference for us. Now we've reopened it again now, but because it's a building where people file through and they have a look and there's hands-on things, we're asking people to wear masks, but we're doing that because the volunteers, in order to get the volunteers to come back, and we run a team of about 45 volunteers to run the NRC, in order to get them to come back and feel safe, then we're asking people to wear masks. So, but the numbers of visitors is fantastic. We had 14,500 in August. And when I was there yesterday, we were doing some filming ready for the convention. And we had our biggest day we've ever had. We had over 900 people through. So there is this sort of this challenge. People are desperate to get back to the real world. The volunteers we have to look after and be careful with. So we ask people to wear masks. But it's starting to come together. And I was at a rally or a hamfest this morning, and there was people coming to the rally that had never been to a rally before. They joined amateur radio during the pandemic with the online exams, and they turned up to see what all the fuss was about. You know, what could they buy? What could they do? And I just think that stuff's an amazing opportunity for us to welcome those people in, you know. But it's all a balance, isn't it? You know, and at the Hamfest, about half of the people were wearing masks, and it depends whether they were outside selling things out of the boot of the car or they were inside. But there was so much chat about, I haven't seen you for 18 months, how's it going? You know, and I saw loads of new people that we'd never seen before. It's just an amazing mix at the moment.
Okay, thanks. And actually, I realized I wanted to say one thing back about in response to Tim. Yeah, I apologize a bit to the rest of the people in RAC in calling us smaller. It's partly because of our neighbor to the south being so much bigger, I think. And what was, as Tim was saying that, I was reminded of participating in one of the IARU regions, the one that we belong in the Americas, where in fact, Radio Amateurs of Canada is the second largest organization. And I guess when we think of international activities and some of the challenges that Tim and the IARU have is to help prepare and strengthen all of those smaller groups that actually have to play the same kind of role that Steve and Rick and my organization do, because they are the one that deals with their regulator in their own country, because each country makes the rules that govern how amateur radio works. You know, each country has to decide how much of what the World Radio Conference has agreed they want to implement, even. So we are, and the other thing, I guess, where several people have pointed out that there's a long history of Radio Amateurs of Canada being very active in international activities, and that really is because our members provide enough donations for us to do it. And we have had people actively involved and in-person attending meetings because of that. So I want to thank everyone who makes that possible. So Rick, there's another thing that maybe was, as we go around here, one of the things that I've noticed through the nets that I participate in, there seem to be quite a few people who, and actually we see this as well in one of the online courses that we started for our higher qualification. It's a bit like the US Extra, our advanced. And there are people who said they've been a radio amateur for a long time, but they'd sort of lost interest, and they now had time on their hands and they've taken a higher qualification. And actually there are a lot of people I encounter on nets buying new radios. So I think certainly the ICOM people must be doing better. I've seen so many 7300s and 9700s on nets. So it's an interesting kind of mix. Some people, you know, one of our major retailers had said early in the pandemic, he thought, like other retailers, that they would be in trouble, and found, you know, their biggest problem is they can't get a supply of stock. So I wonder to the extent that you see those sorts of things, Rick. You're muted right now.
Yeah, there she unmuted me. Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a good point, Glenn. And I was kind of watching whether some of the clubs around here, particularly that I'm aware of, involved with, whether our activity increased and whether we got some of the old members back in. And that's happened some because, you know, people sit at home, they can't go anywhere. They say, what am I going to do? Oh, I think I'll get on my radio, you know, and dust it off and get back on. And we have seen some of that. obviously. And of course, then they say, well, maybe I need a new radio. This one's pretty old, And then what I'm hearing a lot now is now that they're getting back on the air, they realize it's a whole different landscape now, with the digital modes and FT8, and it's just a whole new arena out there for some people who haven't been on in a while. So yes, I think there's been a little of that, although not as much as what I would have hoped. I mean, I think you see some of it, but I thought, I guess, would see a little bit more, and I guess maybe that sounds kind of discouraging, but I don't mean it to be. I think there has been an increase of people getting back on. I just would hope it would have been a lot more, and then, of course, the challenge there for, I think, clubs, and I'm a big proponent of clubs, coming through that my early years, that in my local clubs, just think about them all the time, the value that my old Elmers gave to me. But the challenge, I think, if you look out there over the next year and maybe COVID starts to go away a little bit, is retaining these people's interest in amateur radio. We're always trying to recruit people or get those who have gone off the radar back in. But once we achieve that, the next step is retaining them. And I'm seeing a lot of people over the years, we get them back in, or new recruits, and a year later they're gone. So it's not just recruiting, it's retention as well. So we've got an opportunity, like y'all were talking about, and Steve and Tim and you, Glenn, that with this new virtual landscape and hybrid type situations, well, then as we come back on with in-person meetings, maybe you're going to see more hybrid meetings where you also offer it by Zoom at the same time, that kind of thing. And so there's going to be a lot of changes, I think, in that regard. So we'll just hope that the numbers keep hanging in there and keep going up, and that COVID keeps going down, the way we hope it's going to go. And before I forget it, I just want to highlight that everyone that we do appreciate, and everybody needs to understand the value that IARU has for amateur radio and representing us and our societies. Oftentimes people don't really realize all the work that goes on behind the scenes for the societies, that IARU places their value and work for us in going forward, like these work conferences. And likewise, I did mention Steve a minute ago, but ARRL has got a good relationship with RSGB, and Steve, we've got an open dialogue with him, and we're working on some things across the pond with each other. So it's a real good, makes me proud of the fact we're all together and working for a common good of amateur radio in that regard, Glenn.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Tim, maybe thinking about both recruitment and retention. I'm not sure how many of people here at this meeting know what Region 1 has been doing with youth. It seems to me that from the few things that I've seen, it's more active. There are some attempts in Region 2 to start doing that, but I wonder if you could, I noticed seeing the young, actually it's an interesting cultural difference. They refer to themselves as youngsters on the air, where those of us in North America tend to call them youth on the air because of the different connotations of those words. But I've seen some of the videos, and it seems like it's been a fairly long period. I guess Steve would know about this as well, as being in that region. But your sort of observations in terms of that kind of activity, maybe around the world. And I might ask Steve about afterwards about some specific things about Region 1. In particular, there was a great video that was produced probably at one of those events for young people a few years ago that we've used. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, so Region 1, which it makes up Europe and Africa, part of the IARU world, has had for years a very active youth on the air, or youngsters on the air, YOTA. They have camps where they get together to learn about various radio operation technical skills. And there's certainly a big social activity as part of that. And and that's being copied in Region 2. There was a youth meeting in the US over the summer, which I think went quite well. The challenge is, of course, funding younger people to go to these events. Either they have to turn to their parents, or a lot of societies will sponsor them to go. But there's certainly the social aspect of it. There's certainly the technical learning of it. But also, I think they get interested in the administration of amateur radio as well, and things like how we obtain our spectrum and how we should use our spectrum, and what the spectrum challenges are. And over the last 15, 20 years, I've seen a number of the people who were active in YOTA become active in IARU. And we have a number, especially in Region 1, you see a lot of younger people more involved in our work, more involved at the executive committee level. And that, to a certain extent, is also following in Region 3 as well. So I'm quite optimistic that we're doing a lot to try and attract younger people to get active. And young, Glenn, is a subjective word. It doesn't necessarily mean teenagers. It can mean people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, because, as you know, the demographic of amateurs is certainly a lot higher than those numbers.
Okay, thanks. Steve, do you want to add anything to add? And actually, I don't need to be directing this. If you guys want to pick off to go in another direction, that's fine too.
I'm really curious which video you're using now, Glenn, because the YOTA event in 2017 is something that sticks in my mind. It was like the longest week I've ever had, I think, in this job, because I spent the entire week there with the youngsters at the YOTA camp. It was brilliant, but it was like bidding to run the Olympics. You get it, and then you think, wow, why did we do that? Because it's this fantastically huge event that takes an enormous amount of organization. But it was absolutely brilliant to see that they come with so much enthusiasm to do everything and to fill every hour of the day. And myself and the team that were there, and the youngsters that organized it, and the board members that organized it, we were starting at 7 in the morning and we were finishing about 2 in the morning. It was like that, and we were putting out videos of all of the events every night. There was this production line. But it was fantastic. Everybody joined in and had a go. But we had them operating loads of stations and doing direction finding and kit building and doing SOTAs, and and then we were making all those videos that you might have seen along the way as well, because we knew we wouldn't have the strength for it after the week had finished. It really is absolutely awesome. I would encourage everybody to get involved in it. I really would. But I'd love to know which one you choose. Which video?
Well, it must have been based on that. This was one that opened with an older young person introducing it, a young woman. Yeah. And then it showed. When I've showed it and we used it at clubs, we've used it. Actually, we've been doing presentations at our national finals of the science fair, thinking that children and kids who are already interested in technology are more likely to be interested in amateur radio than the general average. So, and this one, there was one scene I remember. I think it was people who had made were doing well, I guess it showed all of the things you saw. Lots of people building kits, people doing SDR stuff, people people doing I forget what what do you call the
ARDF?
ARDF. But the really interesting lead line that sort of pull people in is that these days everyone, and I'm paraphrasing, but all of the young people know about radios because they carry one around. This is a way to find out how and why they work, and that really so I think you can probably figure out which one that is from some of those descriptions.
Well, so we use the term now a lot, wireless as well as radio, because wireless just sets off something different with the youngsters, but it was just an amazing week anyway. But
well, we've had it's a kind of a combination of both the requirements of doing things online. And I'll mention this again at 4 o'clock, but we probably had our best ever response from teachers and students at the science fair in May of this year, which was done online. where we had a presentation, amateur radio and out of this world experience, that actually was rated the highest of all of the presentations, including by the students and teachers who were there, which because it was online ended up being tens of thousands of people. You know, we even had some people who worked through a little module on CW and sent us a message that they had it encoded doing it. So it's also useful to know the things, and it is amazing. The younger people really like the idea of codes at that even sort of pre-teenage age, and so a bunch of things that catch them. But you're doing, Rick and the ARRL, doing lots of things with youth as well.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's been one of my main concerns for a good number of years. I suspect a number of people on here, looks like we got a big group, 183. I suspect some on here have heard some of my speeches going back over time, where I have really emphasized where's our next generation. And I mean, I hate to even think about what the average age of a ham is. I think I looked one time somewhere, I found some statistics, and it was like 58 years old. And that
might have been a few years ago.
Yeah,
I think it's a little older now.
I think it is. And I think the average ARRL member, for example, is over 60, which is just really is alarming to me. But, you know, we've been working real hard at the league on different programs through the schools, through our networking with the college stations and clubs. Of course, we started that On the Air magazine, which is geared to beginners, back a couple of years ago. We've got the Learning Center, which is still coming online with more and more things. And we've got a new rollout of our Learning Center coming up, I think next month, in fact, in October, which is just been a real great service we've provided for the last few years, building it more and more and more, you know, with webinars and podcasts and things like that. But I tell you, it's just a hard challenge. I'll tell y'all a quick story that I often use to illustrate how it hit me about whether or not we're making an impact with that next generation, that younger generation. Is I often talk to schools, clubs, ham clubs, and science clubs or whatever, and I have for years. And I usually take my pretty DX QSL cards with me, and you know, from Mongolia and Russia or wherever, with all the pretty colors, and I start talking to them about how we can talk all over the world. Of course, sir, I know their mentality is, well, why do I get excited about that? I play games with people on this iPhone from Mongolia and everywhere else. You know? But anyway, so I was talking to a group of seniors at a club at a high school. And I went through my regular spill and everything, had my cards there, and I'm looking at the crowd and I'm going, they're not listening to me. They're not paying a bit of attention. I usually can hold the crowd pretty good when I talk about amateur radio. And I knew I was going to have to change my presentation if I was going to make an impact on these people. So I put the QSL cards down, changed the discussion from, you know, we can talk all over the world kind of thing. And what did I start talking about that made an impact? The computerization of ham radio, SDRs, Raspberry Pi, things like that. In other words, and all of a sudden when I started talking about that, you know, data communications, digital, that kind of thing, you know, how you can read a crowd non-verbally, you know, and they started sitting up on the edge of their chair, you know, putting their elbows up on the table, you know, you started to connect. So this old dog, as I call it, got a wake-up call. And so now when I go and talk to groups, I don't talk about those old things I used to near as much, because it just doesn't hit. And then I think that goes back to looping back around, Glenn and everyone. I really think we've got another concern dealing with retention, because sometimes you can get them and then they go and get their license, but you check with if you don't have anybody mentoring them over the next year, they're going to fall off the face of the earth in terms of amateur radio. And all it is a statistic, you know, in our FCC database. So we've got to recruit and retain them, but I'm telling you, it's a different generation out there right now. One other thing that I think is that I've talked about frequently down here in the States, and it probably is similar over around all the different societies, is, you know, that we have different licenses. The top one that gives you the most privileges is the amateur extra. And then we've got the technician, which just is sort of like an entry level license, gets you VHF, UHF privileges, things like that. Well, 51% of the hams in America are technician. They're not an extra like me. I mean, they probably don't care that much about all these home built things I've got in my background, for example. You know, they want to get on 2 meters or digital modes or whatever. They're technicians. Over half of the American hams are technician licensed. So, but you look at our ARRL members, and it's not anywhere near that. You know, so we've got, you know, we've talked a lot about what does it take to attract, you know, that new ham out there that doesn't look like me or think like me or think like you people on here, you know. So that's a big challenge. I mean, you know, I sometimes get pretty to the point when I'm talking to groups about, look at the faces on here right now. You see any teenagers on here? You see any young people on here? I mean, some of us aren't going to be here 10 years from now. So where's the next generation that's going to be here? So y'all think about that.
Yeah.
Well,
there's another. Go ahead, Tim.
Sorry. No, I was just going to chime in, and I think that also plays into amateur radio leadership too, Rick. You know, we at IARU have a tough time finding volunteers, and sure, they got to have the right technical background sometimes, but it's going to become a challenge to find younger people who want to get involved in a member society to do the work you're doing, Glenn and Steve and Rick, but even at the IARU level, it's becoming a challenge to find amateurs who have the time and have the inclination to volunteer and do the work. And it is a big time commitment. So I think, you know, that's another reason we've got to force the next generation to start accepting amateur radio. Yeah,
That's right, to step up.
There are, you know, I just maybe there's counterpoints in a couple of things. One of them is sometimes I've talked to people in clubs who are discouraged because they put a lot of effort to try to attract young people into amateur radio, and no one has actually gone and done the license. Like there are, that I know Dave Goodwin told me he did an exam of a young woman, a girl actually, I guess I could legally say without getting slapped, because she was only 11, who had passed her exam and flying colors, got almost every crescent white. And Rick, our system is a little bit different. We don't have a technician class license. Our basic license is more like your general. And in fact, we have for our on our basic exam, if you need 70% of 100 questions to pass it. If you get 80%, you seem to be with honors, and that gives you access to every amateur radio frequency. So in fact, the only reason to go to the people who take the advanced probably do it because they want to learn and they want to do things, because the extra privileges are mostly being able to set up a repeater and you know, do those and operate up to the power limits. You know, there's a power limit for the other one. But in dealing with young people get discouraged because no one comes, and I'm telling them that in fact you're planting seeds. And I'm thinking about a number of people who I've met. Often they went into communications careers, and as they're nearing retirement, they're thinking of what do they want to do. And it was because they encountered amateur radio when they were young. So like some seeds take a while to germinate, and the other challenges are different times of your life. You have more or less time that you can give to our activity. You know, I remember someone who, Rick, you and I both know really well, who has been involved in leadership positions in the ARRL, who got his license when he was living with his family because his father was a ham, and then went off to university and got married and raised a family. He was licensed all through that period, but only really became active when family responsibilities diminished, you know. So that That's a challenge too, Tim, with getting, there will be some exceptional people maybe in their 20s and 30s to step in, but if you look at who's able to put the time in, it's reflection as well of their circumstances, what they're able to do.
Well, I think that's right, Glenn. But the other thing is, I think if you look at the history of amateur radio, we're supposed to be at the forefront of technical change. In fact, the amateur service regulation says that we're to experiment in the art of radio and communications. But if you look at the history of amateur radio, we don't adapt very quickly to new technologies, and that's typical. AM to single sideband, for example, and we see that with FT8.
Yep.
There's still a debate about FT8. It's not real amateur radio, etc. But here it is giving an opportunity for new hams, older hams to get on the air and make contact in circumstances where they may not have been able to. But we don't embrace these new technologies. A technology that was invented by amateurs and has become so popular that it's probably, I think last year it was like 70% of contacts were made using FT8 or FT4. But we're very slow to accept that's amateur radio, and we've got to do that. When these new technologies come on, we've got to accept it and say this is amateur radio. And just because it's not amateur radio that people our vintage accept as being real amateur radio, it doesn't mean we shouldn't embrace it and understand that's what a new generation of people are looking at.
Yeah, Tim, as you're saying that, I'm reminded, I might have told some other people this earlier, at one of the Dayton Hamventions I attended, I looked around at the ages of the people who were there and wandered over to the booth where people were playing with software defined radios, and I think the average age dropped by about 30 years. You don't have to be young to do some of the latest technologies, but those are likely to be the ones that young people, and I realize we've actually gone through our whole hour. There were several good questions here. In fact, one of the things that struck my attention was related to, and we haven't explored it fully, the inability to get real feedback in Zoom club meetings the way you would. I think to some extent, keeping everyone's camera on, which is something that we learned at Radio Amateurs of Canada. We used to use the internet like it was a phone meeting, and being able to see people's faces around the meeting actually helps you. Yeah. We don't have time for it now, but Steve said that in fact, in our pre-meeting, there's certain kinds of things you just can't do very well this way. And I think workshops were an example that you gave, where there's a lot of back and forth communication. This works best for people to watch, but we probably spend too much time watching television anyway. That being said, we've got a lot of good presentations coming up. You're only going to be able to pick 1 out of 4 for each of the next 3 hours. But to give you a chance to see them all, we're recording them. They'll be on the Radio Amateurs of Canada YouTube channel, as will this. So I'd like to thank you all for participating, but we have to close this down so people can move to their meetings, to the next presentations that will happen in the next 7 minutes. And I'll be running the annual general meeting at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, brilliant.